The email sat in her inbox for 3 days before Maya finally opened it. When she did, her hand started shaking. Her ex-boyfriend of 5 years was getting married, and he wanted her there. Not just invited, he specifically asked her to come. The wedding was in 2 weeks, and Maya knew exactly what would happen. Everyone would ask where her date was. Everyone would whisper about how she was still single while Derek had moved on so perfectly. She stared at her computer screen in her tiny apartment and made a decision that seemed absolutely insane. She was going to ask her CEO to be her fake date. If you love stories about unexpected kindness and beautiful human connections, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Sage Stories and hit that like button. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's get back to Maya's story. Maya had been working as a marketing coordinator at Hartwell Industries for 8 months. She'd seen Alexander Hartwell exactly 4 times, twice in the elevator, once at the company holiday party where he'd given a speech, and once when he walked past her desk without looking up from his phone. He was 34, impossibly put together, and ran a company worth millions. Maya was 27, still paying off student loans, and ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. The idea of asking him anything, let alone this, made her want to crawl under her desk and hide. But desperation does strange things to people. Maya had spent 5 years with Derek. They'd talked about marriage, picked out baby names, planned a future. Then one day he sat her down in their favorite coffee shop and told her he didn't feel it anymore. 6 months later, he was engaged to someone else. Someone tall and elegant who probably never ate cereal for dinner. The wedding invitation felt like a final test she was destined to fail. Friday afternoon, Maya stood outside Alexander's office for 20 minutes. His assistant had gone home. The floor was nearly empty. She knocked 3 times before she heard his voice tell her to come in. Alexander sat behind a massive desk, his tie loosened, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up, and Maya realized he had no idea who she was. She introduced herself, stumbling over her department name, watching confusion cross his handsome features. Then she just said it. The whole ridiculous truth spilled out, the ex, the wedding, the desperate need to not show up alone and pathetic. She asked if he would pretend to be her boyfriend for one evening. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Alexander took off his reading glasses slowly. Maya prepared herself for security to escort her out. But then he said something she never expected. He said yes. He didn't laugh or look at her like she'd lost her mind. He simply asked when and where, pulled out his phone, and added it to his calendar. Maya left his office in a daze, convinced she'd hallucinated the entire conversation. The next 2 weeks blurred together. Maya barely saw Alexander at work. She wondered if he'd forgotten or if she should remind him, but every time she tried to send an email, her courage failed. Then the morning of the wedding arrived. A text lit up her phone from a number she didn't recognize. It was Alexander, asking for her address. 2 hours later, a sleek black car pulled up outside her building. Alexander stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He opened the car door for her and told her she looked beautiful. Maya, wearing a dusty rose dress she'd bought on sale and agonized over for days, felt her cheeks burn. The drive to the venue took 40 minutes. Maya had prepared talking points, fake relationship details, a whole backstory. But Alexander didn't seem to need any of it. He asked about her family, her college years, her favorite books. He listened like he actually cared about the answers. By the time they arrived, Maya had almost forgotten this was pretend. Almost. Derek's wedding was everything Maya had once imagined for herself. String lights, roses everywhere, a beautiful old barn converted into an elegant space. She saw Derek across the lawn talking to groomsmen, and her stomach dropped. Alexander must have noticed because his hand found hers, warm and steady. He leaned close and whispered that she could do this. They walked in together. The reactions were immediate. Heads turned. Derek's mother actually gasped. Maya's old friends rushed over, eyes wide, demanding to know who this was. Alexander played his part perfectly. He introduced himself, kept his arm around Maya's waist, laughed at the right moments. But something was shifting. The way he looked at her didn't feel like acting. When they sat down for the ceremony and he squeezed her hand during the vows, Maya felt tears prick her eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with Derek. The ceremony was beautiful. Maya watched Derek marry someone else and realized the ache she expected wasn't there. She felt free. She felt like she'd been holding her breath for a year and could finally exhale. When everyone moved to the reception, Alexander pulled her onto the dance floor. She told him he'd done enough, that he could leave, that she'd be fine on her own now. He said he wasn't leaving. He said he was exactly where he wanted to be. They danced through 3 songs. Alexander told her things she never would have guessed. That he'd noticed her months ago, always wanted to say hello but didn't know how. That when she walked into his office with her impossible request, he saw it as the universe giving him an excuse. That nothing about tonight was an act for him. Maya stopped moving. The music continued around them, but she just stared at this man who had every reason to keep his distance and instead chose to step closer. Derek approached them at the bar later that night. He looked between Maya and Alexander with something that might have been regret. He told Maya she seemed happy, and for the first time in a year, she realized she was. Not because she was proving something to her ex, but because the man standing beside her had shown her what real kindness looked like. Someone who said yes when he could have said no. Someone who stayed when he could have left. The wedding ended near midnight. Alexander drove Maya home through quiet streets. They sat in the car outside her apartment for an hour, talking about everything and nothing. He admitted he'd been terrified she'd figure out he was just as nervous as she was. She laughed and said she'd been convinced he was counting down the minutes until he could escape. When he finally walked her to her door, he asked if he could take her to dinner the following weekend. A real date, he clarified. No pretending. Maya said yes before he even finished the question. 6 months later, Maya and Alexander were still together. He'd met her family. She'd learned that he was kind not just to her but to everyone, the janitor he chatted with every morning, the barista who knew his order, the security guard he asked about by name. She learned that successful people aren't always distant and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, even when it feels impossible. Alexander told her later that saying yes to her request was the easiest decision he'd ever made. The hard part was admitting to himself that he'd been looking for an excuse to talk to her for months. Real kindness shows up in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's a stranger who becomes a friend. Sometimes it's someone who says yes when they could easily say no. Sometimes it's being brave enough to ask for what you need and trusting that the right person will answer. Maya went to that wedding terrified of being judged and left with something infinitely more valuable than pride. She found someone who saw her, truly saw her, and chose to stand beside her anyway. She learned that the end of one chapter doesn't have to be written in sadness. Sometimes it's just making room for a better story to begin. We all face moments where we feel alone, where showing up feels impossible. But there are people out there ready to offer kindness if we're brave enough to accept it. There are hands waiting to hold ours through the hard parts if we just reach out. Maya's story reminds us that asking for help isn't weakness. It's courage. And sometimes the person who helps us becomes the very person we needed all along. If this story touched you, share your own experiences with unexpected kindness in the comments. Sometimes the stories we share become the hope someone else desperately needs to hear.